Hi, everyone. I'm Shake Silikian of Shake Silikian Consulting. I'm so excited to have you joining us today for my monthly live conversations with amazing experts sharing with us their knowledge and experience and expertise. And I'm thrilled to have with us today Dr. Two Feathers Orton talking about the importance of compliant and ethical use of AI. Before we jump into the fabulous topic, and I'm sure one that will have a lot of audience participation, drop in the chat where you're joining us from, whether it's your living room in Denver or your office in Brazil. We'd love to know where folks are joining us from. And if you're watching this on a replay, let us know in the chat. We also love knowing where people are watching us, watching the recording. Quick update, this session is being streamed live on 3 different platforms using Restream. So we're on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. So there will be a slight delay. And if you add comments in the chat, it may be a little bit before we see them. It's about a 20-second delay. And we want to make sure this time is helpful to you as well. So let us know where you're joining us from, what questions you have as we have a great conversation about tips and strategies for compliant and ethical use of AI. Dr. Kai, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited for our conversation. I know we'll review some concepts before we get into the tips and strategies. I hear about AI everywhere, right? Whether it's tuning into NPR, turning on the TV, or having conversations with friends and family or colleagues, it's permeating our lives in many, many different ways. So with AI adoption moving so quickly across every sector and industry, why is the discussion around compliance and ethics suddenly the most critical conversation for every leader and employee?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. AI adoption didn't roll out slowly. It wasn't like, there was some announcement and then we had some expectation and then weeks and months and years later, we got here. It hit every industry at once. Tools that were experimental 2 years ago are now embedded into hiring systems, into donor pipelines, healthcare decision supports, financial forecasting. I mean, you name it, and there's an AI system for it, or there's an AI tool use for it. We've essentially deployed a powerful technology without giving people the rule book. And I think that's why we're in the situation we're in now, is because compliance has become critical because regulators are finally catching up to the AI deployment. Every region, whether you're talking about California, Colorado, which is where I'm tuning in from, the EU or Canada, everyone is introducing new AI and data protection laws, and this is coming a little bit after the fact. So there's been a lag. And I think it's because leaders are realizing that one bad AI decision can lead to multi-million-dollar penalties, whether it's CCPA or GDPR or the new EU AI law. But ethics are just as urgent, maybe even more so. Compliance protects you from lawsuits, but ethics protects you from public harm and reputational damage, biased outcomes, or a viral story about your AI that's destroyed, your consumer trust. And we're seeing it all over. So there are biased resume screens that are hitting the headlines. AI models are leaking sensitive data. There are deep fakes in politics. You have hallucinating fundraising messages. All of these are actual headlines. And the real reason this conversation is now unavoidable, I think, is because AI touches people. It impacts everything from whether or not things are perceived as fair, whether things that are supposed to be private are actually treated in a private way, autonomy and opportunity. Essentially, AI, it shifts power. And when technology affects people at scale, ethics stops being optional and becomes a business requirement. So that's that's essentially the long and short of why it's suddenly more critical. Is I think we're seeing lawsuits, we're seeing a lot of fallout to quick adoption.
Yeah, that happens, right? With quick adoption and other things. We've seen it happen in other sectors and industries. But as you said earlier, AI is everywhere and touching all aspects of life and work and society. So it has been really interesting. Thank you for making the distinction between ethics and compliance, right? What's legal versus what is the right thing to do. And I really appreciate that, because sometimes, and a lot of industries have ethical standards that are higher and go above and beyond what is legal in different countries. So I appreciate that. I know that our audience, I see somebody from the Bay Area has joined us as well. Represents every job function. So beyond the legal team, why should a non-technical professional and non-attorney, uh, such as people in HR or fundraising or marketing and finance, etc., feel personally responsible for the ethical use of AI?
That's a great question. And maybe people won't like my answer, but it's really just the truth. And that is that AI, when it's used every day, it's actually not used by AI engineers. Um, it's used by operational teams. So the people who are doing the actual operations, they're the ones pasting donor notes into ChatGPT or drafting a marketing copy or reviewing resumes or interpreting financial projections. These are happening by people who are doing the different operational functions that are so important for business. So the most high risk behaviors aren't happening inside the engineering department, where you would think like the AI engineers, they have to be responsible for the AI. They're happening in the everyday quick tasks that people do without realizing the implications. So if you touch data, then you touch AI risk if you're using AI tools. If you make decisions, then you influence the AI outcomes. If you interact with people, whether that's donors, employees, clients, you shape how AI impacts them by the direct use of those products. So this is why ethical AI is really everyone's responsibility. HR teams, they have to ensure that hiring tools don't screen out protected groups. That's their job. Fundraisers, they have to protect donors' confidentiality when they're using AI to generate segmentation insights. Marketing teams need to label AI content so that it doesn't, become something misleading. Finance teams, they have to do the sanity check on those automated predictions. So it's no longer about whether or not you can use AI, it's about how you can use it responsibly. So ethical AI isn't just a technical skill, it's a workplace skill. It's the new digital literacy, if you will. And organizations that get this right will build more trust. They'll make better decisions. They'll avoid the very real operational and legal reputation risks that are tied to careless use. So it's really all of our responsibilities. Anyone that's using AI has a responsibility to be that human in the loop, to double check the AI outputs, and to make sure that they're thinking about frankly, whether or not they want a product of their own effort to potentially have bias just because they used an AI tool and didn't ask the question of who could it harm.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. I see we have a few people, Svetlana and Raven from the Bay Area and from Northern California, and Charles from New York. Thank you so much for joining us for this really important conversation. Dr. Kai, so let's double click on that, right? A little bit and talk a little more about specifically around data privacy. What is in your opinion, the single most important policy a company needs to put in place to prevent uh, reputational issues, data breaches, or any of the concerns that you mentioned from being an issue for their organization or company?
Yeah, I love this question. And I love that if you would have asked me this question a month ago, which I think this was a question that was asked of me a month ago, I would have said you would want a responsible AI tool use policy and responsible AI use policy. But I think and that's typically like if companies do have their AI governance program fairly sound, that's one of the key policies that they have. But I would go further and say the number one policy that every organization needs to have is that policy if you have a very clear no sensitive data in external AI rule. In other words, the policy that I would be speaking to is a data boundary policy. So this policy has to be straightforward. It has to be very plain language and impossible to misinterpret. And it should be something like, do not enter confidential, sensitive, personal, proprietary data into public AI tools, period. Stop. If you won't email it to someone outside the company, don't paste it into the model. The policy needs to be that clear. And this is super important because data leakage is happening everywhere. People put donor notes, employee performance information, financial projections, medical details, even passwords into LLMs simply because they're trying to work faster and they don't realize that those inputs may be logged and retained and used, to further train the model. And so if you put it in an LLM, it's going to be used. So and these things can now be subpoenaed, so your logs are not private. You might think that you're using your private chat gpt, your private Claude, versus your work uh, models like Copilot, and really all of them are frameworks that you can use for both of those purposes, but they're able to be subpoenaed. So we need policies that essentially make very clear that under no circumstances should you be using data in an AI model that isn't a closed model. So the single most important thing you can do is to draw the line in the sand to say in a policy, here's what you cannot put into the AI model, and here's the safe work environment where you can work in that model, and here's where you can ask if you're unsure.
Mm.
So it goes beyond the policy also to a standard operating procedure.
I love that oftentimes organizations talk about policies which tend to be broad because we can't necessarily think of every single scenario, especially in this ever evolving space in terms of how the legal component and ethical components are catching up with AI, right? The tool was out there before. We were thinking about the safeguards and the guardrails around it. So I love your suggestion of having very specific examples and having a person or a team or a contact of, if you're unsure, better ask than try to guess the information. Earlier, you also mentioned bias. So I know we don't have a ton of time, so I'm trying to hit on a number of topics, but tell tell me how you think organizations can vet for bias. What are some very tangible and specific ways that they can see if a model is biased or if a tool might be built on a bias?
Yeah, I think this is super important for the times that we're in. And I would say with utter confidence, assume that every tool is biased until it's proven otherwise. AI learns from historical data, and historical data reflects historical inequities. And so it's the safest bet to just assume that every tool is biased. And if you make that assumption, then you would want to audit every tool in 3 phases. You'd want to stress test the model, give it real or synthetic examples from diverse groups, change names, zip codes, education paths, so on and so forth. Check whether or not the outcomes disproportionately favor or reject certain people. And you can do this before the model goes live. You can do this with models that have already been accepted and even recommended, because it's your data, it's your decision making, it's your business. So you owe it to yourself to check that. A second way is compare human versus AI decisions, and see where they diverge. If your model is harsher or more lenient, this is where hidden patterns emerge. And if it rejects single mothers more often, or it penalizes people with community college degrees, if that's a decision that the AI is making and that's not a decision that a human would make, then that tells you that there might be some bias there. The third thing you can do is look for explainability or traceability. And what I mean by that is, if a model can't tell you why it made a decision in a way that a human could, that's a governance red flag. So high stakes systems require visibility. So any output that AI gives you, you should be able to ask it to explain what was part of its decision making process, in the same way you would hold a human accountable for making a decision. So the things that teams should be looking for is disparate rejection rates, correlations between demographics or proxies and outcomes, looking for missing data or skewed training sets. You don't want to use data sets that have missing data or skewed training sets, because that's obviously going to influence the model. You can also have models that degrade over time. And so you want to consistently test your models to make sure there isn't model drift. And then lastly, if you're using models that are made by other vendors and they're not models that you're creating or training yourself, you want to make sure that the vendor has shows you some example of how the model works, and be mindful of that relationship. Bias audits aren't a one and done exercise. They're repeated safety checks. You don't trust that a bridge that was built in the 1950s is going to be sound all the time. You do regular checks to make sure that everything is okay. And just like a bridge, AI is an engineered system, so we need to be mindful of drift. We need to be mindful of changes that naturally happen over time. And your oversight has to also evolve as well.
Thank you so much. I did want to mention, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Sama, from Ohlone Land, also known as San Francisco, also mentioned. We are essentially giving our data away to billion-dollar companies, right? The importance of understanding of the power of data that each of us individually have, and then collectively as organizations and companies. I do want to be mindful of, you and I are not saying we shouldn't use AI. I know in the nonprofit sector and some sectors, it has become just stay away. And I personally feel like the nonprofit sector sometimes is too cautious about jumping in to use technology tools, and then is scrambling to catch up. And I don't mean during this conversation to imply that we shouldn't use AI. And so I wanted to ask you about that too, and your philosophy around how do you think people should be thinking about, should I just stay away because of the environmental factors, because of the ethical factors, etc., or should I have my own personal and organizational policies about use, because this is already happening and staying away would put me at a disadvantage.
Yeah, this is such a human question. And I love that you've asked this. Um, I think that to use AI or to not use AI, maybe a couple of years ago, could have been a question that I would have answered very differently. I would have said, of course, it has, very dire consequences to the environment, to energy use, to all of this stuff, and you might have been able to make a choice to not use AI 2 years ago. Now AI is enabled in so many of our systems that even if you're not using it directly, you might be using it passively, in the way that you shop for Amazon products, in the way that you listen to your Spotify list, in the way that you do a bunch of different mundane things. A lot of the tools that are just part of our daily lives, our digital lives, have already been assisted by AI in some way or form. And so to choose to use it actively in your workplace or not, maybe is the question at hand today is, should I use AI for my work, for my personal use? And I would say, we're seeing headlines where companies have chosen to let people go because they're not using AI tools because they want to boost the efficiency of their teams. And so I don't want to offer advice to say don't use it if you don't feel like it isn't aligned with your ethical mores, because that could put you at a disadvantage. I would say instead, we should all be thinking about how to use it responsibly. I'm a big fan of human in the loop use. And so whenever you're using an AI tool, you should basically imbue it with your expertise. That's how we get more powerful decisions. That's how we make better decisions with an AI assist. And I would say, don't be afraid, dive in, immerse yourself. This is the era that we're in, but always ask those questions. If you're using AI and you're using data, how does what does this data, what data is feeding this model? What assumptions does this model make? How am I using this model? Who can be harmed by the action that I'm taking? And also, I think we need to be mindful that when we're using AI, there's no, it's not like online dating apps a couple decades ago where we needed to feel some shame by saying that we were engaging with this type of technology. If you use AI, acknowledge that you've used an AI assist, and also make sure that it's apparent where your decision making, where your expertise weighed into the ultimate endpoint and output of that interaction. I think it's really important that we acknowledge both, how we're using AI so that others can learn from it, but also using it responsibly to make sure that we're mitigating any harm that we can avoid.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I love the parallels you draw between the shame that sometimes can be associated with new technology, right? Whether using or not using. I think transparency is an important aspect too, right? And so I'd love to invite our audience to ask questions, put your questions in the chat. We want this to be interactive, but as they do that, given the delay that we have, talk to me a little bit about transparency. I think some people are afraid to say this was created with the aid of AI. But what's the drawback to not telling people?
I think the drawback to not telling people is, of course, we're hearing cases where people who are, you know, obviously not using AI or not saying that they're using AI. Um, you put yourself in a situation where you can kind of tell AI products pretty clearly now, whether you're using a Claude model or OpenAI or Copilot or ChatGPT. All of the LLMs are sort of converging on the same type of outputs, which basically tells you that even though they're trained on different models and they might have different userships, um, they're converging on the same type of outputs. And so that's the first thing is, it might be pretty obvious that it's an AI output. And by not admitting it, you're sort of putting yourself in a situation where it seems like you might have the ethical dilemma of admitting that you're human in the loop. The second thing is we've seen that human in the loop is proving to be more potent and better at its performance overall. So it benefits you to say that you are using it and to distinguish where your talents lie and where the refinement of using AI or the AI assist is coming in. There's also, when it comes to transparency, as I mentioned, your logs can be subpoenaed. But also, I also mentioned other people can learn from you. If you log your prompts, you can help train other people to use AI in much more expert and efficacious ways. A lot of people don't realize that the very fine-tuned way that they articulate a prompt, once you become really good at prompting, is actually a really strong talent. It's a skill in and of itself. And so by logging your prompts, you allow other people to learn from you. You also know you have a log of what worked really well for an output before. And you can further refine that output. So I think there are a lot of reasons to be very transparent. Also, if things go wrong, they can go very wrong with AI because you have this basically entire model that may be propagating bias. And if you just put an output out there and it's hugely biased and you say it's your own, then you have to accept the accountability for that as well. And it
Yeah.
might be subpoenaed. And so then you'll be found out doubly over. And these are all bad things. These are all very bad things.
I actually have a really benign example. I have a 14-year-old, and he was trying to find an image. Neither one of us are great artists. He was trying to find an image of a book for a book report. And I said, I use Canva all the time, and he's very anti using AI, generative Gen AI tools. Let's try Canva and see what it does, right? Asking it to create things, and gave it some prompts related to this book and asked it to help us. And he was very, very hesitant. Anyway, we asked, and it came up with a beautiful image. And his response was, Mom, that's beautiful, but they're all wrong. These are not what should be based off of this book. I had no idea. I hadn't read the book. They look beautiful. I could have, and it was an iteration of again, not an illustrator or an artist, but working with the Canva AI tool. But it needed the human in the loop to say those are wrong. These are not the images that we want to be creating, right? From this. So,
Absolutely.
um,
Absolutely. I have a fun, not so fun story where I asked AI to create an animated avatar of myself, and it created a picture of a native man in a farm field with a computer. And I thought, like, there are so many things wrong with this image. First of all, I'm not a farmer, but I do love nature. So I'm glad that it picked up that element from my identity, but also it automatically assumed that because of my role that I was a man. And when I asked it to ground itself, and so you can ask AI to ground itself, and that's when you ask it to give the justification behind how it generated an image or an output. It admitted that it was biased and made the assumption that I must be a man given my role, and then very politely asked me if I wanted to change the image to a female, which of course, why would I not? Because I am a female. But these are the types of things that happen with AI and why human in the loop is so powerful. So great example. And yeah, I'm glad your son has a healthy dose of skepticism.
Thank you. Thanks. I see we are at time. I wanted to make sure to be respectful of people's time and your time, Dr. Kai. Before we wrap things up, any final words of wisdom for our audience, either the live audience or folks who will watch this on replay? And knowing that these things are evolving on a daily, sometimes hourly basis. So, right now, in this moment, any final words of wisdom?
I think the the best advice that I can give is values aren't posters, they're practices. And so your employees, if you're an employee, need to comply with expectations that are clear and concrete and connected to their daily tasks. And so if your policies, if your procedures, if your values aren't clear, then you should expect that people are going to have some confusion. And so AI ethics and AI compliance goes beyond a mission statement. And it's not magic. Magic happens when people can say, yes, I know exactly what my organization means when they say, use AI with integrity or responsibility.
I love that. So many amazing quotes. Values aren't posters. It's not magic, right? I love those concrete ways of describing what needs to happen. Dr. Kai, thank you so much for joining me today for this amazing conversation. I know I would want to go on for hours, but again, I don't want to hold you up. I also wanted to say thank you for joining us during the week where you haven't been feeling well. I so appreciate you rallying and taking time for this important conversation. Finally, on behalf of all of us who directly and indirectly benefit from the work that you're doing about talking about ethics, talking about compliance, and helping organizations and companies think about data integrity, data security, thank you for caring so much. I've personally appreciate all that you're doing in our community. And there are some love emojis flying. I don't know if you saw that, but thanks for your
Thank you
time.
so much. It's been a pleasure.
Fantastic. Well, thanks to everybody for joining us. Let us know what resonated with you, what other topics you would want to hear about in the future. Leave us comments. We will certainly look at them and respond to them on the different platforms. And I hope to see you next time. Thanks.